All right, we're recording. Auto, dude. What's
What's
up?
going on? Nothing much. Just sitting here enjoying a nice plastic glass of Dr. Pepper once a
Mm.
week while we
I'm
discuss Rhodesia.
I'm enjoying an airborne uh, immune booster mixed into water because I definitely have a cold now, so that sucks.
Well, at
But
least those things smell good.
yeah, taste all right too. But want to play the
Indeed.
intro?
Yep, let's run it.
Play the intro.
National Bar Association vigorously describes how his administration is fighting communism abroad and at home. And then he says,
All right, so today we're going to try and do a rundown of the Rhodesian Bush War from start of hostilities to the end. And we're going to talk about some major engagements. We're going to have a special focus on tactics and talk through some battles, piece by piece, play by play. Listener, be warned, we are not professionals. This is amateur hour. We are wildly unprepared to do this, but we're going to do it and have fun anyway. And hopefully anyone listening has fun as well.
As long as fun, doesn't, include, dropping into the actual bushes of, Zimbabwe and, taking live rounds, we should be all good.
I think I would have more fun doing that than I have in college. So,
Yeah. I mean, it'd be exciting.
it would be exciting. It would be exciting. All right, where do we start?
So
1965 UDI hostilities open with what, where, when, who?
So that's kind of tricky to say because even though that's when we consider the war starts, it's not really full scale starting till really about 1972 to the attack on Altena Farm. So before that, um, when the Universal Declaration of Independence for Rhodesia was unilateral, my bad, sorry, tripping up today. Um, when that starts, when that happened, the different factions of Zanla, Zanu, Zapu, Zabumafum, whatever you want to call them, they they tried to resolve things at the ballot box before the cartridge box, and that wasn't exactly going their way. Whether it be the Rhodesian government censorship or just the fact that you're trying to start a communist revolution in, for lack of a better word, a former British colony that has tons of people that, whether black or white, they kind of in some way identify as British to some degree. They've
Yeah,
been
that's an interesting
civilized.
point. Yeah, because we've talked about this before, like how people want to paint the Rhodesian Bush War as either a ethnic conflict or as actually this is just part of the Cold War. It's actually just like we're just fighting the Reds, and both things are true and simultaneously not true. It's a lot more complicated than that, and that'll be an interesting thing to talk about when we talk about some Selu scouts and the pseudo ops later, because it wasn't that at all. Sorry, continue.
No, you're good. You're good. You're good. I was distracted by some in the background anyway. So really, the hostilities begin with the attack on Altena Farm, which is going to be in December 21st of 1972.
So last episode, I think we did talk about the Battle of Sonoya, though, right? Which was like the minor incursion in 1966.
Yes, there were some things going on, but to paint a picture, I guess, for the audience if they haven't got it already, the Bush War is not it's not like a active war like we'd think of. Imagine this. Imagine if we lived in a country like Afghanistan, except there is no U.S. military. It is the Afghan government basically in opposition to the Taliban, but there's no real declared war. It's just different, you know, one group that claims to be the government is fighting one group that's basically claiming to be, rebels. And, there's no
There's no big
massive,
arrows. There's no massive invasions. There's
no,
nothing that
no.
clearly demarcates
I
the
mean,
beginning of the war.
technically, a battle of the war could be two people of the opposite faction have a gunfight in the street.
And most of the engagements were small. I mean, this is in many ways like in so many insurgent conflicts, the nature of the warfare was more like a police action. It's basically like this security problem that just gets worse and worse and worse and worse. And in many ways, that's an intentional strategy of guerrilla forces more often than not. The point that people always say, like, oh, why do guerrilla forces, why do terrorists, as we sometimes call them, use terrorist techniques? And it's a deliberate strategy to destabilize the government, because eventually a government that has limited resources can only deal with so many landmines and farm attacks and bombings and fire bombings and this and that. You destroy enough infrastructure, you hurt enough people, you destroy the government, you paralyze the government, and that is how guerrilla forces win. It's
And I
not
mean,
not with big invasions.
even if we look at the biggest guerrilla war I'm going to go out on a limb and say the biggest guerrilla war in history, the Vietnam War. Um, I mean, every time there's only one time we really even see the communist forces of Vietnam launching a full scale battle or campaign against grounded Western forces, which is Dien Bien Phu, where they literally surround a French army in a valley and fight a World War One style battle for months and wear them down to where they're starving and they force them to surrender.
Right.
I mean, look at Tet. I mean, Tet offensive. That had goals, but the goals wasn't to completely capture Hue. The goal wasn't to completely capture Khe I mean, you even look at Khe the whole goal of that is literally to make the U.S. military think that is the main attack before they attack Hue. And the whole point of that was just to kill Americans, get the public upset, say why are our troops fighting a full blown war in Vietnam, and
Yeah.
to
And I've
say
said this before. I think I said this in the last episode, but conventional militaries use warfare to achieve political ends, but more often than not, guerrillas have to use political victories to achieve their military ends, because they know that they can't win on the battlefield. The Rhodesian rebels could never defeat the Rhodesian military outright, so they just have to attrit them over time.
yes, and we're going to see today that even on a small scale circumstance, they the rebels find it very hard to even win gunfights against Rhodesian forces.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Sorry, I don't want to go on another tangent before we even get
No,
into it, but
you're good. Do
so
you want
okay,
me
so
to?
1966, Battle of Sonoya, not really a battle. We talked about it last episode. We'll skip it. Basically, 5 years go by. The Rhodesians are kind of lulled into complacency. Meanwhile, the rebels and the insurgents are trying to figure out how to actually prosecute this war. So there's not a whole lot of fighting going on. Take it away where I interrupted you.
Okay, so I was going to say is that Altena Farm is considered what the main start of the war, and we look at one side, we have the rebels, and their main goals are to attack Rhodesian infrastructure, attack farms, attack settlements, plant bombs. Versus the Rhodesians, their goal is to find actual terror cells and root them out. Root them out. And so Altena Farm is basically the first real serious attack on a farm. And so on December 21st, 1972, um, Mark de Bortgrave's farm is attacked by insurgents. Um, Now, I think we talked about this off the air, but there's some, how can I put this, discrepancies with the information involved, and I believe that
Many such cases with this war.
our sources kind of conflict on some things. And I'm under the impression that what happened is that these insurgents a few nights before basically kind of had planned to, already, fiddle with his farm, and they came up there trying to cause trouble, might have planted some mines, and they got spotted and ran off. And so the next night they come back, to just basically kill everybody there. But when they do, they go there, they kind of cause a scene of disturbance, and as with this is kind of what we're trying to get at, is that this is not like a real war in the sense of what we think of as war. There was a group of Rhodesian soldiers nearby who were literally in earshot of what was going on, who responded. Something happens, a gunfight, firefight erupts, and a RPG gets shot through the house, injuring Mark and his daughter, but they both survive.
So I'm going to read verbatim from my book, which is The Rhodesian War Military History by Paul Moorcraft and Peter McLaughlin, which is my primary historical reference source. It's got a paragraph here, and it actually details a little bit of the discrepancies, but even what it has here is different from what you said. So I'll read verbatim here. On 21 December 1972, Zanla attacked the isolated Altena farm in the Centenary district. An 8-year-old white girl was wounded in the foot. According to Rhodesian sources, this attack was meant to be part of a simultaneous assault against 5 farms, but the Altena group misread their instructions and struck 24 hours prematurely. The Zanla version is different. Rex Nongo was the operational commander in charge of 21 men in the Nahanda sector, the Zanla name for the area. He ordered the Altena attack in order to divert the security forces which were closing in on other guerrilla groups in the Mtoko region. The de Borsgrave family, who lived at Altena, moved to an adjoining homestead, Whistlefield Farm. 2 nights later, Zanla launched a rocket and grenade raid, which wounded de Borsgrave and his daughter. And in the morning, a relieving security force vehicle detonated a landmine. A white corporal was mortally wounded, and 3 other soldiers were injured. On 28 December, another 3 Rhodesian soldiers were killed in a landmine blast. And then it goes into a little bit of what happens after that. Other attacks on farms followed. The guerrillas had infiltrated into a wide arc from Simpolilo, west of Centenary, to Mtoko in the east, and southwards towards Chiweshe and Madziwa TTLs. The real war had started. Operation Hurricane, which we can talk about that, was set up to repulse the guerrilla drive, but the response was slow and unsure. The Rhodesian war machine had grown soft with complacency. So this is talking about what we were just saying. For 5 years, more or less, the Rhodesian government had put their head in the sand as to what the situation actually was. And in this book, it does detail some of the kind of political intrigues about why that was, because there were elements of the Rhodesian intelligence apparatuses that were pushing the government leaders, saying this guerrilla problem is real. We have a war on our hands, whether you like it or not. But there were other elements, other political leaders and other departments within the Rhodesian government who were saying, no, this is a minor security problem. This is a police matter. This is not a war. We don't have a war on our hands. There's no guerrilla uprising. Now, if you read the book and hindsight 2020, obviously we know those people were completely wrong. Like, they were burying weapons caches with tens of thousands of rounds of ammunition and RPGs and burying landmines everywhere. This was not like a minor police matter. They were preparing, right? And that's the thing that the guerrillas did right, you might say, because after those initial incursions in 1966, 1965, they got schwacked and they realized, oh, we need to kind of take a step back and reevaluate our strategy, reevaluate our tactics, and they did that. And the intermediate time period between Altena Farm in 1965, 1966, they really backed off and they pumped the brakes. And in doing so, the Rhodesian security forces, the Rhodesian government, fell for it, and they really just ignored the problem, pretended the problem wasn't there, not knowing that the guerrillas were actively planning, infiltrating, establishing caches, establishing networks of informants, political cadres, mujibas, which we talked about last time, and preparing for a full-on war in the future. And you see how that went. So
that's a it kind of reminds me of World War II, when they call it the phony war, when basically the only fighting had been the German invasion of Poland, and the Soviet invasion as well, and that Britain and France had declared war on Germany, and there was serious mobilizations, but nobody was fighting, no operations had begun, and there was like a lull from basically like September of 1939 to the summer of 1940. No fighting occurred, and people were thinking, is this even real? And just goes to show you that when war's declared, or war happens, stuff's going on. Don't get if you find yourself in a war, which if you're probably younger than 18, you probably will be in a war at some point in your life. So I'm sorry. Just stick it to the Chinese. Um, if
But
they're not
this is like the pathological nothing ever happens gang, you know? Like this isn't a new phenomena of
at
where
a certain point, yeah, like I'm quite honestly like in the nothing happens gang till something happens,
nothing happens until everything's happening. Exactly.
and
Yeah.
and that's how most people are. I mean, you look at the stock market crash, Black Tuesday. I mean, I'm not you just don't know. Yeah, it's better. I'll say this: it's better to be more concerned and it's better to have the idea and the mindset that things could be happening. You don't know they're happening, so you're basically going to keep, on edge in case
Yeah,
something happens.
and you actually said that in the Discord today. One of the Discords we were talking about how Martyr Made, I can't remember that guy's name. He just went on Tucker Carlson and was talking about World War II revisionism, and Pete Quinones had basically said that this is a clear demarcation of a vibe shift in in politics and in the way we view our history and our kind of our founding mythos as a country, as really as the West as a whole. And there's a debate about that. It's like, is this nothing ever happens, or is this an actual happening? And I think you don't know until 30 years from now. You can look back on the books that have been written and chart everything out on a timeline and say, oh yeah, this actually mattered,
Yes,
because
yes.
nobody ever remembers the things that don't matter, but this is how history works, so
Yeah. And to kind of say that it's like, and this is a problem I see online, and this is, for everybody, you know, being in, these big head circles, I'm going to consider us big heads, um,
big brain.
big brain circle. You see a lot of people that they have these takes that they're willing to, draw the line in the sand like it's the Alamo for, and go out and fight. And I just think of, my opinion on, even, minor things can change, so quickly in a day, that, why not big things? So, like this morning, I was listening to something about the Trump event that happened back in the summer where somebody tried to hurt him, and they were throwing out all this speculation as to what it is and who did it, and past things, and it's like I just really don't care.
Yeah.
I
No,
don't mind people creating ideas or thinking
yeah,
things,
the
or
conspiracy theory
but
stuff, and
I don't
yeah,
like
right.
people going out on a limb and saying this is it, and if you don't absolutely agree to this, you're just a black pilled loser who needs to like go home and be ostracized.
Yeah, yeah. No, I we need to end this digression. But I
Yes.
do think, like, what was I going to say? The This is kind of, especially nowadays with social media, this is kind of a symptom of viewing politics, history, and the world around you as though you are a spectator rather than an agent that can actually affect change. This is something we deal with the Old Glory Club, things that we're actually, trying to be proactive and involved rather than just spectating and treating politics and history as if it's a TV show, because it's not, and it affects your life. But yeah, no, I do think it's like people watching a serialized television show and then you're left on a cliffhanger and everybody wants to speculate until the next episode comes out. So, um,
It's like
but yeah, no,
yeah, it's like the
yeah,
sports
thinking about things
channels
and right, right,
in the summer. But anyway, we go back to the
yeah,
Rhodesian
yeah.
Bush
Sorry,
War.
yeah,
Um, so yeah, do you want to pick up on where we're at? Because in my timeline, I
yeah,
have us jumping 2 years ahead.
yeah. So let's see. I bookmarked something in here. So after the Altina raid, guerrillas are filtering in from Mozambique and Zambia, and the Rhodesian forces do start mounting raids into Portuguese territory because at this point Mozambique is still controlled by the Portuguese, um, and they had been working alongside the Portuguese army, but the Portuguese at this point are losing their grasp both on their own country because Portugal itself has a coup. Which precipitates the collapse of the Portuguese Empire, what was left of it, I believe. Don't quote me on that. If we're talking
Yes,
about Rhodesia, not Portugal, but
yes, that's correct.
okay, okay.
I didn't do my due diligence in researching the regime change in Portugal, but if I remember rightly, from being terminally online, that basically Portugal and Spain had existed in this what I'm going to call the last of the far right governments. And in Portugal, you had Lisbon, you had Salazar, who was their version of Franco.
Right.
And when he got deposed, I don't remember if it was he died or got deposed, a basically soft liberal regime rose up, and like all Western people at that time, pretty much were sort of kind of anti-colonial, and they just immediately pulled back. They sent their they wanted their troops home, and so pretty much overnight, Mozambique, which is has Portuguese troops, fighting and protecting the Portuguese assets there against Fremlo, who are the Mozambican equivalent of Zanla, Zapu, Zanu. Um, well, Fremlo is going to become Mozambique. It's kind of like with the war in Afghanistan, you have the Taliban versus the United States and the coalition. Well, when the coalition leaves, the only people that have the power there really are the Taliban. They take over. Well, next thing you know, they run the government of Afghanistan. As far as I'm concerned, they're Afghanistan.
Right. Right. And so it's funny because the Rhodesians very obviously did not see the writing on the wall. Skimming through my timeline and my book here, during this period, the 1972, 1973, 1974, the Rhodesian government starts to crack down on support for the guerrillas. So imposing heavy fines, closing shops, clinics, schools, churches, in different areas where there was, censorship, closing down, businesses and whatnot, in areas where the guerrillas were, working. Rhodesian army sweeping through areas and basically telling people, you're going to inform on the guerrillas, or your schools and your shops are going to be closed, and they're going to stay closed. And so they had, intelligence improvements from this allegedly, but as you can imagine, that's exactly what the guerrilla forces want the government to do. They're losing the hearts and minds war and basically creating more guerrillas. Many such cases historically, right? And then as time is going on, they start implementing the protective village, the PV program, which was implemented in many other places. Vietnam specifically, I'm not sure about Malaya if it was done there, but the PV program, the protective villages program, as it was done in Vietnam, as it was done in Rhodesia, basically the security forces in these countries prosecuting the war against the guerrillas in these countries, realized that it's really, really hard to defend lots of small, sparsely populated villages. So they're going to go into these places and tell these people, hey, you guys are moving. We're going to build you guys a new house in our fancy schmancy protective village. And protective villages sometimes worked out quite well. They had good amenities and they were great. Other times they were shitholes and really, really bad place to live. And were not popular with the people who were forced to live there. But strategically, it's easier to protect small, strategically located, fortified villages, or rather consolidated, larger villages, rather than tons and tons of smaller settlements spread out across the countryside that are more difficult to protect. And it's not even necessarily about protecting them physically from, say, a guerrilla raid. It's about protecting them from guerrilla influence and preventing the guerrillas from extracting logistical support, finding recruits, generating support for their cause politically. So that's really the reason why protective villages were started. But they start doing this at this time period. And interesting to note here is a line in the book. The government starts standing up more local counterinsurgency groups. So these are still primarily police forces, and advocated in particular by one Alan Savory, who was a maverick Rhodesian Front MP, but his views were ridiculed by his party, especially when he became an outcast from the Rhodesian Front party. The government still maintained publicly that the insurgency was a, quote, temporary emergency. It was not necessary to plan for a protracted war, a long war of attrition, which would bleed Rhodesia dry. Foreshadowing, right? Okay, this is 1973. They're still talking like they don't have a war on their hands. Okay, I'm sorry. If people are shooting rocket-propelled grenades through my living room, I don't care what country I'm living in, or there's a war going on. Yeah, okay, like that's a surefire sign. If you find an undetonated RPG lodged into your couch in the morning, you're in a war zone. Okay,
and you need to move.
First of all, buy a new house. Yeah, get on Zillow immediately.
Get on
Find a new house to
Zillow.
live in. But
Shoot,
you're in a war zone, bro. Like, sorry,
this
you
is this
can't
is
pretend you're not.
this is Chirac when they.
Yeah, bro.
I mean,
Yeah, okay.
when they start carrying around RPKs with drum mags and no stock, this ain't no Saints Row. This is more like Cabal 2022
Yeah, yeah,
or
and
2021, and you need to get out before
yeah,
you get left behind.
yeah. In 1974, the regular army was expanded partly by encouraging foreign recruitment, and then a second battalion of the Rhodesian African Rifles was formed, which again was a black unit with white officers and white NCOs? Question mark? Maybe. Don't quote me on that.
I would like to speak a little bit on that, those foreign
Yeah, go for it.
mercenaries. So the foreign mercenaries in Rhodesia, so just to break it down, like the whole concept of being a white mercenary in Africa during the Cold War is kind of like a cool concept that is, kind of vaguely tossed around. People still, there's still you see still remnants of it, left over today. We think mercenaries, we think white dudes just operating in Africa fighting, dudes with AKs, and that's true. We see, the first white mercenaries we're going to see in Africa to begin with are Commando 5, led by Mike Hoare in the Katanga province of the Congo. Um, and they're going to be, it's a mixed, reception. And, a lot of these guys are World War II vets, mostly European. Um, they have a mixed performance because with mercenaries, like all people, you're not exactly getting, you're either getting, political ideologues that are fanatics, or you're getting crazy people that basically can't operate in normal society and have to operate like Vikings. And Rhodesia knows this, and so that and the censorship they had in the country kind of made it a long time coming for mercenaries to come there. Um, but they're going to put an ad in Man's World magazine, and not Man's World. That's
Soldiers of Fortune,
is
maybe.
Soldier of Fortune. Is Soldier of
Classic, dude.
Fortune. They put an ad in there. I don't know what year, remember what year it is, but they put it in there, and they have the famous, "Be a man amongst men" advertisement, and that basically is the first call up for foreign volunteers, Rhodesia. Now, here's the deal about these quote unquote foreign volunteers. You could call them mercenaries, and a lot of them were thinking that they were going to be mercenaries, but really, they're it's almost like substitute soldiers.
Yeah, like
They're
mercenary groups historically were highly paid, very expensive, professional, well-trained soldiers that were going to fight usually because governments either couldn't raise their own forces or because they didn't want to shed their own people's blood, so they would hire foreign mercenaries.
Yes,
What these Rhodesian the foreign mercenaries were integrated into Rhodesian units by and large. It's not like they were operating by themselves. This wasn't like Blackwater where they were a separate unit operating under the command of the Rhodesian military. You had Irish, Americans, Australians in regular Rhodesian units. And this is again, remember what we talked about last episode. The Rhodesian population was climbing in the early and mid 1960s. It reached its peak like in the beginning years of the war. So most of the people who were living in Rhodesia were immigrants, and there were still this tiny population of white Rhodesians relative to the number of black Rhodesian natives who were living there. So it's no wonder that they were trying to call up and get more immigrants to come specifically to come and fight. And then that also goes into, sorry, go ahead.
I was gonna say like that with these quote unquote mercenaries is these are skilled men. A lot, especially there's like 200 Americans that enlist, and most of them are all Vietnam War vets, and I believe a lot of them were people that saw active combat in Vietnam. So it's not like they're not getting good quality people, but it's that a lot of these mercenaries are not mercenaries. A lot of these people think they're going over to be hotshot mercenaries, and what instead they get is the younger ones get thrown into pretty active combat groups like the light infantry, Sela
Sailor
Scouts,
Scouts. Yeah.
SAS, but a lot of them that are older, um, they get put on. This is maybe where you could say more real. quote unquote mercenary work gets thrown in, a lot of them get put in as just basically guards on farms, which is
Right.
needed. I mean, you got to
Right. Yeah,
understand, like,
absolutely.
this is a war where average civilians are having, occasional gunfights with, terrorists.
Right. And that's an
Um,
important thing to talk about the strategy of the Rhodesian military at this point. So 1974, they expand and reform their call-up system because most of the Rhodesian forces, the fighting Rhodesian forces, were not full-time soldiers. Their actual full-time soldiering force was very, very small, and most of the soldiers that were fighting in the Bush War were regular civilians who were part of either reserve force or police force. And again, police force, these are more like National Guardsmen or like Texas Rangers in the late 1800s, right? Like these are use police force with with
Grain of
a grain
salt.
of salt, yeah, a grain of salt. And so they would go out and they would do 4-month deployments and rotate. And actually, there's a guy on YouTube, Five Romeo Romeo. I've talked about it before. I love his videos. He was in a reserve force like that, and he saw lots of combat because they would go out in 4-month rotations and come back and work their civilian jobs. And later in the war, as they extend the timeline of their deployments, more and more of their fighting age men are gone and not contributing to the economy for longer and longer periods of time. This actually ends up opening up job positions in a lot of the cities in Rhodesia for Black natives, which contributes to the civil unrest, as you can imagine, because you're bringing in a lot of war refugees from the rural areas into the cities to work these jobs. And then and then you have these fighting age men who are gone for longer and longer periods of time. And as the war drags on, they extend the length of their deployments to meet their manpower requirements. And again, they're being attrited by the guerrillas as a deliberate consequence of the guerrilla strategy. And then, oh yeah, 1974. I highlighted this in here. Rhodesian intelligence estimated in 1974 that there were only between 70 and 100 hardcore guerrillas operating inside the country. Now, whether or not that is true, it's unclear because the guerrillas for most of the war operated with very, very small numbers. It wasn't until the very, very end of the war that they had tens of thousands of armed guerrillas. For most of the war, they only had several hundred, which think about that for a second, right? Rhodesia, a country that is the size of like what Alabama. It's smaller than Texas, but
Yeah,
it's yeah, like Alabama or
probably
Georgia or something like
Alabama or
that.
Georgia.
Yeah, and an entire country can just be just completely subverted by a few hundred violent guerrillas who are obviously supported from abroad logistically. They have logistics bases in the neighboring countries, but just think about that: a few hundred people. And this is the nature of guerrilla war, right? This is what Castro talked about. This is what Mao talked about. All of they by mid-war, when the guerrillas really got their shit together, they were operating a proper guerrilla war, and that's why they were so successful. Because a few hundred guerrillas across a country the size of Alabama or Georgia, I mean, in the bush, you're good luck, man. Good luck.
Hmm. And I guess kind of the end the whole talk on the mercenaries, because I kind of want that was an important. I
Yeah,
say
vamp for a
important.
second. I gotta go blow my nose because I'm sick, and I'm gonna grab another Zin. So
No, you're
vamp for
good.
like
So basically, these mercenaries are mainly American and Commonwealth. A lot of them are Anzacs. And the Americans will obviously, they'll form the infamous, Crippled Eagles informal organization, which we were talking about how these mercenaries, they didn't join their own mercenary units, but a lot of them had downtime and things like that, and they would hang out with other mercenaries. And the Americans formed this informal club called the Crippled Eagles, and the name and a book was written about them by a one of their members who was an author that was over there, and he's basically serving as almost like a quote unquote, we use this word, unit historian for the Crippled Eagles, and he basically wrote about them and made them famous. A lot of the Americans, though, they actually left after their first deployment because they found the conditions hostile, and they weren't getting paid mercenary money. They were getting, I mean, they literally, when I talked
getting
about they
paid
were basically
soldier money, boy.
they were basically substitute soldiers, is they were basically going and joining the Rhodesian military as Rhodesian soldiers for however long their contract was, getting paid soldier money and then going back home. And so most of them just said screw it and left because
Fair
there's no
enough.
reason to fight if there's if you're gonna go way out of your way to fight, you better fight for the big bucks. Now
Right.
the only real actual mercenary company formed, and it's formed by the Rhodesian government at the behest of these mercenaries, is a group for the French. And I don't remember the exact name, but they were a failure. They had, horrible combat statistics. A lot of them got killed or injured in duty. And it doesn't help that they're not operating in a part of Africa where French is the lingua franca of the region. So they're operating on their own, basically in a country where nobody understands them, and they're taking horrible losses. So the government viewed it as basically a net negative and just cut the program.
Mm.
And that's all on sale mercenaries.
Yeah, that's a good note, because I know, like, from our kind of cultural mythos, that's why we think about Rhodesia. That's how we know about Rhodesia, because we all dream about being a mercenary in the Cold War fighting in Africa somewhere. But that's, reality is sometimes less interesting than fiction. But
Yes. Now, I guess to get to the real nuts and bolts of real man's work, is talking about the actual military operations conducted by the Rhodesian
let's do it.
forces. We talked a
Let's do
bit
it.
about Fire Force. We talked a bit about some of those tactics and their equipment and things like that, and some of the units. But now we're gonna actually talk about like what missions they went on, and what were some of the results of those missions. And the main big ones are Operation Eland, Operation Aztec, Operation Dingo, and I believe you maybe had some notes on Operation Hurricane.
I do, yeah. So Operation Hurricane, it's a little bit more. So it gets confusing, right? Because they're all called operations. These are the code names. Where Operation Dingo and some of these other ones, Eland, these were code names for specific raid missions that were conducted, cross-border raids. But Operation Hurricane, Thrasher, Repulse, and Tangent, and Grapple as well. These were basically the creation of how would you say, like strategic regions of operation. And Hurricane was one of the earliest ones. It started in 1972 in the Northeast, where most of the insurgents were coming in from Mozambique. But these were kind of larger, broad scale, long time period operations intended to push back the insurgents back across the border. So I don't know if you really want to go into that in detail. It's kind of tricky to talk about. This is kind of like trying to describe one of these operations would be like trying to describe Operation Enduring Freedom, right? Operation Enduring Freedom, right? It's like, how do you describe that? It took place over what, 10, 15 years or something like that. It's just a code name for another part of the guerrilla war. It's really not. I mean, we could talk about it, but it's no. That is the Bush War. These are the operations that comprise the Bush War from the Rhodesian Security Force perspective.
So
more interesting ones are Eland and Dingo and stuff like that.
Yes. So I guess to begin with Eland, so Operation Eland, also known as the raid on Nyazonia, it begins on August 9th, 1974. And now to give some, context to this, Mozambique is still under Portuguese control. There's still a war being fought by Portuguese armed forces against Fremlo there, which Fremlo, if the audience, if you forgot, is pretty much the Zanla Zapu Zamumafum of Mozambique. They will become the Mozambique government in the next year. So August 9th.
Also, correction, quick.
Go ahead.
Quick correction. It's 1976, not 1974. Operation Eland. Yep, Eland. It's 1976. I've got it in three. I've got 2 books and a Wikipedia page pulled up. You said August 9th, but it's 1976. Yeah, so it's a couple years later when the war is actually starting to heat up.
Okay, well, you guys just
dude, we're putting out info hazards, bro. We're disinformationing people.
Okay. So August 9th, 1976. So let me change up my script a little that I was just going to, do. Okay, so Portugal, Mozambique has fallen. So hit the sirens, hit the alarms, let the water ring out. The Portuguese are no longer in Mozambique. And before that, Rhodesian forces were launching small raids into, Mozambique at the behest, help, and support of the Portuguese government.
Yes.
They were basically allowing it and, actually not even allowing it, approving of it and, wishing you success.
Yeah,
And
the
they were
extent to which
effective.
they helped obviously precipitously dropped as their political situation at home and in the colonies
But
deteriorated.
when June 25th, 1975 occurs, um, there is no Portuguese presence in Mozambique. And so in August 9th of 1976, the Rhodesian security forces, I believe it was a group of Cella scouts, are going to, and the RLI, RMC, SAS, you
Yeah,
guys get
it
the
was
gist.
a big operation.
Real killers, real killers. They're going to get disguised as Fremlo agents, and they're going to go to this Zanla camp called Nyazonia, and they're going to kill approximately 5,000 quote unquote insurgents.
Yeah, and what precipitates this is on August 5th, a group of about 60 guerrillas attacked a security force base at Ruta, which is north of Umtali. No casualties were caused, but from the Rhodesian perspective, it was extremely unusual for the guerrillas to hit a base in such numbers. I mean, that's huge. Most of the guerrillas, you got to remember, they're operating in about a section or a squad size. So they're 7 to 12 guys tops. For 60 of them, I mean, you're talking a company minus or a platoon plus. I mean, that's a lot. That's a lot of guys. And then a couple days later, 4 territorial soldiers from Umtali were killed in a mortar attack in the Burma Valley south of Umtali. And then another guy died in pursuit operations of those guerrillas. So for a small, close-knit community like Umtali, the loss of 5 local guys was a big blow. And the townspeople were the ones who demanded action against the guerrillas, and that's what precipitated the Nyanzonia raid.
So 84 Cella scouts under, command of Rob Warwicker are going to attack this camp. They have some armored cars and things of that nature, and they're going to put on these Fremlo uniforms. And what they do is they hide a lot of the white soldiers inside these trucks where they can't see, and they keep a lot of the black men on the outside to make it seem legit. Now, one of the commanders on this mission is named
So they're
Morris.
pretending to be Frelimo.
Yes, they're pretending
okay,
to get in the base. This guy named Morris Nathati or Nyathi, he was a former Zanla commander who's now turned into a Cella scout, and he is basically the one, like, quote unquote, like, talking and doing all the actions, and kind of by a luck of divine providence. If you're a fan of the Rhodesians, they were not going to be let into the base by one of the guards, and Mr. Morris basically jumped out of the truck and just started yelling at the guy, and the guy listened to him immediately and let them in.
Because he spoke Portuguese, this guy, this SAS guy, right?
I don't know if it had anything to do with that, maybe other than that he recognized the guy as, oh, that's like one of our like top guys.
I'm trying to skim through my book and see if it says anything about it here. I see. Okay, it says here the SAS man ordered in quote abusive Portuguese the gate to be opened. It was 8:25 a.m.
It was basically, the gist is this crazy, just open the gate happens, and they get let in. And when they get let in, the camp is, basically like kind of rallying up for the morning to do their communist, trainings in the parade ground.
They're formed up on the parade ground.
And
all of these guys.
These trucks are literally going to pull in and get right in front of them. Now, you gotta kind of think about it. These Zanla people are probably sitting there. All these trucks coming in, and all these soldiers on it. And they probably kind of think like, oh, that this might be like a surprise, like inspection or something. So they're probably not even thinking about, oh, it's 84 Cella scouts ready to gun us all down. And something to the gist of, I don't remember if one of them got on an intercom and said something, but they kind of play them, and then all of a sudden, out of nowhere, The Rhodesians basically pop out at the blow of a whistle and they just start gunning down everybody there. They
Would you
literally,
like me to read the
yes,
play-by-play that I
read
have in this
read the play by play.
the Peter McLaughlin book here?
Yes.
It's pretty crazy. All right, so 8:25 a.m. So the scouts dropped a mortar unit off at the entrance. All right, then they drove onto the parade ground where excellent intelligence had accurately predicted that the inhabitants would be assembled. While the SAS man and a Shona-speaking scout harangued the assembly with revolutionary cliches, the Zanla cadres began to swarm around the Rhodesian vehicles. All right, so they're talking to these guys like they are for limo. They're hyping them up, workers of the world unite, whatever. All right. Eventually, as those pressed right against the vehicles realized that whites were inside, Warwicker, who I believe is one of the SAS guys, gave the order to fire. Initially, at point blank range, 3 twin MAG machine guns, 1 50 caliber Browning machine gun, 1 12.7 millimeter heavy machine gun, 2 Hispano Suiza 20 millimeter cannons, 3 30 millimeter 30 caliber Brownings on the ferret armored cars, and the personal weapons of the scouts themselves opened up. Carnage ensued. Hundreds were shot, burnt, or drowned while trying to escape in the nearby Nyanzonia River. The commander of the Selu Scouts later wrote that the raid was the classic operation of the whole war, carried out only by 72 soldiers, without air support and without reserves of any kind.
I think somebody I watched recently this week in preparation, they did a like line by line guide of like how many actual weapons were fired on this. And I think it was something to the effect of like 60 FALs were also discharged, and that's like what 20 to 30 rounds of mag. But yeah, point is like they just cut down 5,000 people right there, then
Point
and
blank.
there.
And
Point
so
blank.
the Bush War operator book I have, AJ Ballum, it says here that he was actually the commander of that mortar section that was dropped off at the gate. And they were basically caught in the crossfire between the Selu scout column and the Frelimo that were getting massacred. So they're getting pounded by a wall of lead, partly from their own guys. And then they're trying to, I think the point of the mortars was basically as a cleanup operation to attack
Munitions and things like that.
Yeah, munitions, and then as the guerrillas were fleeing to basically provide a wall of mortar fire on
And I
their
believe
routes of egress.
two Cella scouts got injured, and I think all the injuries were minor, like they got grazed by a bullet, like they were up and operational. And from my understanding, they killed them. They killed those people. They destroyed the camp and they left. They were there that quick, got out.
Oh, dude, ready? Listen to this. This is from AJ Ballum. This is a quote from his memoir. Long yellow flames shot from the barrels, vehicles shuddering under the recoil as the entire column opened fire. Faces disintegrated, bones shattered, meat shredded, blood boiled, skin burned. I watched, fascinated by the horror unfolding before my eyes. Bullets smashed into the vehicle I was standing on, bringing me back to earth and giving me a frightening reminder of where I was. Then silence. Awesome, eerie in its completeness. Still lying between the two mortars, I cautiously lifted my head and looked about. Where 30 seconds ago had stood a large, cheering crowd of terrorists, there was only emptiness and silence. The column vehicles were still in extended line facing the parade ground, the occupants frozen, staring in disbelief at the death and destruction they had wreaked. The escape routes. Do not forget the escape routes, a tiny voice reminded me. One of the main reasons the mortars had been brought along was to put down fire on likely escape routes and cause as many casualties as possible to the fleeing terrorists. 20 seconds later, standing unsteadily and covered in a thick layer of dust, grass, and leaves, I managed to croak, fire.
Dang.
Brother. Oh, man.
You just can't get that. I just can't believe that
Happened.
Even happened. Yeah. 5,000 people. I mean, I wonder if they have.
Talk about a security failure, bro. Imagine being the guy at the front gate who let them in.
I mean, maybe he survived, but I mean, I wonder how many mags each individual soldier went through in that. I mean, obviously it sounded like they didn't have to go through much of them. They got them down in 30 seconds.
I mean, they had all the crew serves there too, which I'm sure did most of the heavy lifting. But
and you have you can penetrate bullets through bodies and just
man,
they're just that act of just cold, callous gunning down 5,000 people.
What was the final casualty count of that? Do you know?
I think it was like 5,000. Like,
let's see. What does Wikipedia have?
Let's see.
Casualties and losses, at least 1,000 plus killed is what it says.
Okay, so not that crazy.
And an
But
important note, do you want to talk about the refugee thing? Because I know we were talking about that off air, how the guerrilla side later would claim publicly that it was actually a significant portion of those people were, quote, refugees, civilians.
yes, so after this event, there's, I believe this might be where I'm getting the 5,000 from. There's mixed sources on like how many dead there are, and there are reports that 5,000 people in total died. And it basically just it looks bad, you know, from the, from a military standpoint, it is what it is. But from a like kind of aloof, cosmopolitan, internationalist viewpoint, all you see is basically, racist, restrictive regime goes into a camp and guns down like 1,000 plus people.
Right.
So the whole international community, including the United States and Soviet Union, are basically going to condemn Rhodesia. South Africa is actually going to remove all its military personnel from the country. It basically, I don't want to say it's a nail in the coffin, but it absolutely turns everybody pretty much against Rhodesia after that.
Now, so yeah, okay, looks bad, but I think it's important to color, this is part of the guerrilla strategy, right? The guerrillas have these massive training bases and logistical bases in Zambia, in Mozambique, in all of the bordering countries. And so these are bases that have not only, yes, cadres, commissars, actual guerrilla fighters in training, but the civilian logistical core that supports them. And yes, a lot of them are, quote, refugees or just people who are there kind of hangers on because, I mean, right, Mao Zedong said the guerrilla swims like a fish in the sea of the people. Okay, you see that a lot in the Rhodesian Bush War, and you see that a lot towards the end, where by the end of the war, basically every black Rhodesian in the bush was a guerrilla or a guerrilla supporter, because that's how guerrilla forces win. So, I mean, yeah, I'm not here to condemn that particular action. I think it's probably a good idea from their perspective, right? I mean, you're having these massive border raids, 60 plus guerrillas coming and attacking your places, and you know where they're coming from. Why not just go wipe them all out? But yeah.
Yeah, I mean, really to be real, I mean, you go in knowing you're going to attack this base, and like you just got like 5,000 people swarm your car, and your job was to, from the get go already just to gun them down. It's like you're probably just going to do it because, I mean, they're beating up on your car. All they got to do is just get in, grab you, and doesn't matter if you have guns or not. They literally can rush you and disarm you and beat you to death. And
Yeah.
I say that to say that all that in mind is probably why they went through with it. But at the same time, it's a military target. It's where these, attacks were coming from. They kind of had to do their job. And it doesn't really matter if the, United States or even the Soviet Union cares. It doesn't. Their opinion of it doesn't matter because they already don't support them. They already don't like them. It doesn't matter.
Right. Well, and think about it from the propaganda aspect as well. If this was, say, a United States bombing run on a Viet Cong training camp, and they happen to carpet bomb 1,000 civilians along with the guerrillas that were there, that's one thing. But when you go and shoot them point blank range, it's a much bigger propaganda victory for the guerrillas, because now you can say, oh, look at the Rhodesians, they just came and gunned down all these civilians. But the effect is still the same. This is something people get weird about war. This is kind of like Lieutenant Colonel David Grossman, is that his name? Lieutenant Colonel Grossman wrote that book On Killing. And that's one of the things he talked about is it's like psychologically human beings have a different perspective on killing another person that correlates with the distance of the weapon used, so shooting an artillery shell onto a house or bombing somebody is a lot different than shooting them. And the same thing also works from the propaganda campaign, because yes, you're right, all the cosmopolitan liberals looking on from abroad think that looks a lot worse than if they had just bombed that place. So yeah, that's,
Yes, and that's really all I had to say on Nyazonia.
yeah, we can move on. Yeah.
Because I mean, we really don't know who was laying there dead on the ground at the end of the day. And I really doubt that the Rhodesians went and searched all those people to identify who they were. Um,
So
I
we
mean,
can. Do you want to
yes,
take a detour and talk about pseudo operations in the Salu Scouts, seeing as we were talking about the Salu
yes,
Scouts?
we can.
So in the last episode, we did introduce the Salu Scouts. We talked about how they were an 80% black unit, and we briefly touched on their tactic that they were famous for, and what they really did was the pseudo operations, but we didn't really get into what that was. And I want to read a chapter here out of AJ Ballum's book, Bush War Operator, because he was in the Salu Scouts, and he has a good anecdote on what a pseudo op actually was. So if you permit me to read a couple pages, we can maybe give people an idea of what that actually entails. Let me get a drink of water here. All right. The Snatch, Eastern Highlands, Operation Thrasher, early 1976. So same time period. We're going chronologically. That's good. To snatch or capture a person whom it is necessary to keep alive is a very difficult operation to accomplish, more so at night. It was hot, sticky, and uncomfortable sitting around the smoking fire, but it was a necessary evil. We had to make sure all traces of the smell of washing powder on our clothing, toothpaste in our mouths, shampoo in our hair, and our own body odor were eradicated and replaced by the smell of smoke and sweat, the aim being to smell the same as the locals. This was done to try and fool the many dogs that each village was home to into believing we were locals, hence obviating their need to bark. 2 hours later, smelling like mobile meat smokers, we were ready to move out. We were operating in the Chimanimani Mountains, Chimanimani Mountains, our base an old deserted farmhouse about 3 or 4 kilometers from the Mozambican border. Our task was to capture alive a certain Mozambican local responsible for the movement of Rhodesian terrorist groups crossing the border into Rhodesia. That evening, 8 of us crossed over into the Mozambique, 4 white and 4 black scouts. As usual, the black scouts were walking in front in case we bumped into any locals or terrorists on our way to the target. The reason was simple. They could speak the language. Our cover story was that we were a group of freedom fighters wanting to cross into Rhodesia, but we needed to speak to Mr. X, our target, to find out where it was safe to cross. Dressed as we were in a mixture of Frelimo uniform and civilian clothes, carrying AK-47s, wearing chest webbing, and completely blackened up with the foul-smelling camouflage cream, the chances of us being recognized as whites were very slim. So they're going to be wearing these uniforms, and most of the time they're wearing full pants, full jackets. The whites are anyway, to cover their skin. But any white skin that is exposed, they will cover with a quote "black is beautiful" cream, is what they would call it. So it's a black camouflage cream that is designed to hide the fact that they are white. Okay.
Yes, you can find some pictures of.
Yeah, you can.
You can look up pictures of the bush war, and kind of easy to find.
Yeah. As we approached the first village, the tension started to mount. Would the dogs bark? Would the locals run away? Would we be accepted as real terrorists? Would we be ambushed? The same questions always hovered in the back of my mind. I had been on such operations in the past and would go on more in the future. The feeling of impending doom, the stiff-legged pair, the stiff-legged gait, the aching shoulders, the pounding head, the staring, glazed, red eyes, the straining ears that always seemed filled with the sound of crashing waves, and the vice-like grip on the AK-47 were to be my companions on each and every border crossing I did. Progress was slow but steady. We were well received by all the locals we met, and our cover story was accepted without question. Yes, they knew the man we wanted to talk to. Yes, he was the contact man for the area, and all freedom fighters reported to him before crossing into Rhodesia. We approached each village carefully, stopping often to listen and check the ground to our front for anything suspicious. It was a full moon. Every shadow looked like a terrorist. Every sound sounded like an AK-47 safety catch being switched to automatic. The information we had received on the whereabouts of our intended victim led us deeper and deeper into Mozambique. What should have been a simple locate and remove was turning into a slog. Village after village, kilometer after kilometer. Still, we found nothing concrete on the whereabouts of Mr. X. Time was running out, and we were thinking of turning back when our luck changed. We were in village number 9 or 10, asking the same questions and getting the same answers when an old man who had just been sitting there listened and joined the conversation. Yes, he knew Mr. X. In fact, he knew where Mr. X was sleeping that night. According to the old man, Mr. X was extremely worried about his personal safety and did not sleep in a hut, but rather in the middle of a cattle kraal, surrounded by sheep, goats, and cows that acted as his early warning system. And furthermore, according to the old man, he did not like to meet groups like ours at night. That was a minor problem as far as we were concerned. Once we had located him, the rest would be easy. Or so we thought. The plans of mice and men. After receiving what can only be described as vague directions from the old man, we headed off in the direction of where we thought the kraal was situated. The spring was back on our step, morale was on the up, and I even noticed the odd smile in the bright moonlight. Several cattle crawls later, the feet were dragging, the smiles were gone, and the complaints were on the way up. Time was running out. We were deep into Mozambique, and it was touch and go. When it seemed as if failure was inevitable, our luck again changed. There, standing upright in a kraal, surrounded by sheep, goats, and cattle, was the man who could only be Mr. X. We all stared at him in disbelief. We had just about given up, and there he was. Now came the difficult part. If our job was to kill him, there would have been no problem, but we needed him alive. He would know the whereabouts of all the terrorists in the area, how many had crossed into Rhodesia, where they had crossed, and when they were due back for resupply. The man was a goldmine of information. We needed to get him back to Rhodesia in one piece as quickly as possible. Looking at him bathed in the moonlight, surrounded by animals, you knew this was not going to be easy going. He was over 6 foot and built like a tank. Phase 1 was to get him to leave the protection of the animals and the kraal of his own volition. There was no way we were going to get him out by the use of force, short of killing him. 2 of the Black Scouts strolled up to the kraal and, leaning against one of the wooden poles, started talking to him. By the way, a kraal is basically just a pen. It's a cattle pen. I have no idea what they said, but he kept shaking his head, gesturing to the rest of us sitting in an extended line, 10 meters or so behind the Black Scouts. That he was not happy about something was obvious. The moon was very bright and visibility was good. So I wondered what he had seen that had made him suspicious. It had been a long, hot, tiring night. Looking around at the rest of the group, everything appeared fine. But the way we whites were dressed, long trousers, long-sleeved shirts, jackets, and in some cases balaclavas, in our attempt to blend in had led us to sweat profusely. I was hoping the sweat had not removed the camouflage paint from our faces. A couple of minutes later, after much talking, gesturing, and pointing, Mr. X finally moved. He still looked unhappy. We would walk forward a couple of meters, shuffling the livestock out of the way. Stop and look around. Progress was painfully slow, but after what seemed forever, he finally left the protection of the kraal. Phase 2 now swung into action. The plan was to take Mr. X to meet our leader, who happened to be an ex-Rhodesian boxer. When Mr. X was close enough, our patrol leader, the ex-boxer, would hit him in the stomach and hopefully wind him, thus giving the rest of us a chance to get a set of handcuffs on him. The operative word here is hopefully. Looking at Mr. X as he walked by, I began to have my doubts. The man was huge. He appeared to be all muscle, and it was going to take one hell of a punch to wind him. Talk about David and Goliath. This time, I figured David had bitten off more than he could chew. It was like an old silent black and white movie. There was not a sound. Even the livestock in the kraal had fallen silent, as if they could sense something dramatic was about to take place. We all watched in numb fascination. Everything was bathed in the pale yellow light of the moon, no colors, only black and white. The tension was palpable. No one moved, as if we were props on a stage, unable to influence the outcome in any way. The boxer then punched him in the stomach, but nothing happened. Mr. X seemed unaffected. I could not believe my eyes. I had seen the boxer hand out some quite serious hidings to some pretty big guys in the Salisbury nightclubs. Failure was not an option, as we had no plan B, so we reverted to the old standby of brute force and ignorance. All 8 of us jumped on him, but we could not wrestle him to the ground, never mind subdue him. He was tossing us around as if we were children, the adrenaline and a healthy dose of fear giving him amazing strength. He had been hit very hard several times on the head with rifle butts, but to no avail. He simply would not go down. Standing on his own, chest heaving, covered in dust, blood gashing from the deep cuts inflicted by the rifle butts, he showed no sign of surrender. You had to admire the man. Like a leopard surrounded by a pack of hunting dogs, he was going to fight to the death. Everything ground to a halt. We were exhausted, and most of us were carrying bruises and cuts from our attempts to subdue him. In the entire 5-minute fight, not a single word had been uttered, apart from the sound of shuffling feet, the thump of landing bodies, the sound of heaving chests trying to get oxygen into burning lungs. The whole struggle had been strangely quiet. Time was not on our side, and we had to end this quickly, one way or another. As we stood there staring at each other, the contest took a turn which sealed Mr. X's fate. Darting forward, he grabbed a large piece of wood and attacked one of the Black Scouts. The gloves were off, and the time for playing was over. There was no way we were prepared to let him injure any of us. What had been admiration quickly turned to anger as bayonets flashed in the moonlight and Mr. X collapsed. Whether he died or not, I do not know. I like to think he did not and is still living in his village, occasionally telling his grandchildren the story of the fight he had with the white men dressed as black men. He was a brave man, and he deserved to live.
Dang.
Yeah, so the pseudo-ops, that's what the Selu Scouts did. They pretended to be terrorists. They snuck around. That's why they were an 80% black unit. And, that is one particular kind of operation they did, a snatch and grab, but a lot of other operations, they were just going across the border or oftentimes within Rhodesia proper and conducting long-range reconnaissance for weeks at a time. There's another story that A.J. Ballum talks about where Sergeant Major A.J. Ballum was a white NCO in charge of a section of 8 or 9 Black Scouts, and he was hiding basically in a radio post where he was like starving, basically living off the land for weeks, nearly dying of dehydration and hunger, operating his radio, communicating with the Black troops that were going around gathering intelligence. And at one point during that particular story, one of the Black Scouts was found out by a Mujiba, which Mujiba is a teenager or a boy who's supporting the terrorists, acting as a scout or a runner or a lookout. Basically, the story ended ambiguously with AJ Balaam telling the Black Scout, to let him go. And this particular Black Scout, I guess, in his kind of James Dean kind of, confidence, told him that, oh yeah, don't worry, Sergeant. Sergeant Major, don't worry, I let him go. But the implication was there that this Black Scout had killed this Mujiba and dumped him in a cattle kraal somewhere to avoid basically exposing the rest of the Selu Scouts as they were operating. So,
well, so that hopefully gives y'all an idea about the operations of them and kind of like the gist of what's going on. And we noticed that throughout these stories, it seems that there's more and more and more operations and involvement in Mozambique, almost like it's becoming part of Rhodesia in a sense of operation.
mm-hmm.
Do you want me to go with talk about Operation Aztec?
Yeah, let's do it. I don't have any notes for that, so
Okay.
I'll support you as best I can.
So basically, Operation Aztec is an event that occurs from May 28th to June 2nd, 1977. And now this whole time, we've been seeing with the Cella Scouts, we've been seeing with other groups that, targeting, terrorist infrastructure is, it's basically, giving back what the terrorists are, giving them. And so in ironic Gaza province, the Rhodesian security forces are going to try to destroy the Mozambique railway. So early in the morning, they're going to head out on a column, almost kind of like what happened at Elan, with Flemo patterned vehicles, uniforms, et cetera, et cetera. They're going to head in and basically go into their objective. This time, though, they're supported by Canberra bombers, the Rhodesian Air Force. For lack of better words, the target they're going after is called Jorge de Limpo, and they're going to smack this place, hit it, attack the place, kill everybody there, and they do that, and they leave a group of men behind, and I'm not sure as to why they get left behind. If it was logistics, but the idea is they leave them behind, kind of to make sure terrorists don't come back. That was kind of a strategy they would employ, but something happens to where they can't really exactly evac them. And so while the destruction of the railway is going on and things like that, this place called Jorge de Limpo, um, this like 20-man group roughly are pretty much just kind of waiting around, and they notice that about 50 to 70 Zanla insurgents are coming down the road, and they are in combat gear and they're ready to go. And they make the smart observation that they can't take them on in a fight. So what they do is, this is a rural area. They run and hide in the bushes, and they hide. They get down. They're observing them. They think everything's fine, and then all of a sudden, mortars start raining down on them. And at that point, the cover's up. The Zanla, insurgents that outnumber them begin attacking them, and all the Rhodesians can do is basically hide, and they don't fire back. What they do is they let the Zanla insurgents, basically shoot at them like crazy, and then when they go in close quarters to check on see if they're survivors, the Rhodesians are basically laying prone and just one tapping them, and then they're dragging their bodies and hiding them in the bush. So it's kind of like this game of cat and mouse where the Zanla people know that there's Rhodesians there, and the Rhodesians are basically trying to figure out how can they turn this, basically at this point for this little group, like a failed operation into a success. And they fight for about, I believe, like 2 days. And eventually, after a while, um, Rhodesian forces, wipe out this group. They, rebomb the area, and they're able to, destroy the railroad, and they get this little ragtag force that was held behind back. And that was kind of what I wanted to say on Operation Aztec. That's kind of a rundown of it.
One one of the interesting notes there is the tactical discrepancy between the guerrilla forces and the Rhodesian forces. And you see this time and time again when you see the stories in the Rhodesian Bush War. One of the stories that AJ Ballum actually talks about after the Bush War, when he was basically participating in some failed coups for the South African government as a mercenary. He was training basically terrorist groups, ironically enough. And one of the things he noted about trying to train the native Africans to use their AKs in the way that the Rhodesians would use their FALs, or in that Western countries traditionally trained for marksmanship, basically impossible. He kind of in jest in the book said that, training an African was so difficult because they so often thought that volume of fire, switching your AK to full auto was what won gunfights, and teaching them to instinctively go to semi-auto and actually take accurate shots on target, get kill shots, how difficult that was. And it's not strictly related to this, but that tactical discrepancy, a section of Rhodesian infantrymen, is vastly superior to even maybe a whole platoon or a whole company of insurgents. Obviously not a great scenario to be in, but you see this over and over and over again, where the dismounted tactics of the Rhodesians in a pitched battle against the guerrillas, it's not even a fair fight. So
no, and a lot of times it's funny that we think these Rhodesians think, oh, like they're about to get murdered, and they end up, absolutely, dominating their opposition.
Yeah, many such cases.
That's, and the commander of, Operation Aztec, Lieutenant Colonel Ron Real Daly, he didn't really think it was that much like that successful of operation. And he thought that the best thing that they did was that they killed a bunch of these, agents, and he thought that the enemy is basically like, their morale was knocked down by it. The fact that that they basically kind of accidentally drew in a large force of insurgents and picked them off, wiped them out, bombed them, with Canberras, and yeah.
To
They,
follow up, sorry, go ahead.
Basically, they thought that it was more important that they had killed all those people than that they had, done damage to the railway to some extent.
Yeah, and that, I mean, again, the Rhodesian strategy, and we talked about this last episode too. The Rhodesian strategy was much like the United States and Vietnam, is just body count, body count, body count, or in Afghanistan for that matter. To give credit where credit's due, the American strategy in Afghanistan and Iraq has always been more advanced than just body count, body count. But especially in Vietnam and especially in Rhodesia, that was the strategy. And it's not an effective strategy when you're dealing with insurgents. It's just a misunderstanding of how the conflict is actually unfolding. Do you want to talk about Chimoio?
Chimoio,
to kind of build off the tactical discrepancy between, like, the tactical overmatch of the Rhodesians versus the guerrillas. Do you want to talk about that?
Yes. So, Chimoio, or the attack on Chimoio Farm, also known as Operation Dingo, that occurs from November 23rd through 25th, 1977. And this is going to be kind of in the same sense of what happened at Nyatzone. They have reports of this camp. There's possible refugees there. It's a training camp. But they have to attack it. And the ROI, the SAS, Rhodesian Air Force, they're going to get activated. And basically, the plan involves this guy named John Murphy, who is I know I went on the whole thing about mercenaries earlier. Well, this guy's a mercenary pilot. So he's kind of like this sort of, he's not like a combatant, but he basically flies for the Rhodesians. and he's going to fly a civilian plane to draw off the awareness of this base camp, because this base camp has anti-aircraft guns, and part of this operation involves Rhodesian forces paratrooping, jumping out of planes into the hot zone. So they're trying to figure out a way, how can we essentially speak, get these guys to calm down, and then destroy their anti-air assets so we can get troops on the ground. And he's successful in that. He flies by, they panic, they freak out, they see that, oh, it's actually a civilian airliner, so they don't shoot it down this time. I know we talked about early in the war they'd shot down a civilian airliner, but then when he passes about 10 minutes later, so when the Canberras come by, they bomb the crap out of the insurgents. This time, though, instead of running for their lives, a lot of the insurgents actually get their guns and they jump up on defensive positions and basically expect an attack to come. And pretty much what happens is that the Rhodesian forces pretty much break open ground and they have a running gunfight into the camp. They full on headfirst attack these insurgents. They kill them. They take out the anti-aircraft guns. There's going to be two casualties for the Rhodesians in this operation. One of them is going to get shot, and another one's going to die in a crash landing. I don't remember if it was specifically that one of the vehicles had accidentally got shot down by a brave rebel, or if it was that there was something wrong with the vehicle and it crashed. But those are the only casualties in this operation. But the main target of this operation was to get Joshua Tongongara and Rex Nongo,
Nongo. Yeah.
Nongo, and they weren't there, but they had a successful operation in regards of killing. And kind of like what we said with Aztec, they leave behind a force to wait and see if anybody comes back. And this time, nobody comes back, so they just leave. They cross back the border, and that is actually after that. There's 30 more border crossing raids till the end of the war. But that was like the last, I would say, major border raid that caused significant damage.
Yeah. So according to the book I have here, this was actually the largest raid of the war to date. And just for some numbers on their Air Force, they had 42 helicopters, 8 Hunters, 6 Vampires, 3 Canberra bombers, 6 Dakotas, and 12 Lynx aircraft deployed for airstrikes and to transport the 185 Rhodesian troops. And so Operation Dingo was comprised of 2 parts. One of them was the raid on Chimoio, which you just talked about. And then there was another raid. There was another assault wave to overcome Temboye. I don't know how you say it. 220 kilometers from the Rhodesian border inside Mozambique a couple days later. And the raid on Chimoio, interesting to note, there was 185, 200 troops attacking Chimoio, and there was thousands of guerrillas, vastly outnumbered. And they did try to pull a similar stunt as they did at what were we talking about in Nyanzonia? Yeah, Eland. Yeah, so there was a Hunter bomber that dropped flechette anti-personnel darts for the first time in the war, and it hit the parade ground, but apparently a hangover had prevented the Zanla commander from summoning the men to the parade ground that day. The RAF's Peter Boyer actually personally inspected the parade ground after the flechette, after the battle, and thought that had the troops been summoned to the parade ground that day, it would have been a similar situation to Nyanzonia. And the casualties, ComOps estimated that Operation Dingo had cost Zanla in excess of 3,000 trained men and approximately 5,000 wounded, and many subsequent desertions. And like you said, the Rhodesians suffered 2 dead, 6 wounded, and 1 vampire that was downed.
And it's the only thing I can think of that was like what we really think of as a battle. Like I said, that this time the insurgents stayed to fight, and they went up against. I mean, this is like if the Navy SEALs went and fought, like attacked a Taliban base and wiped them out.
Yeah, this is like some
combat.
This is like some 1980s like action hero stuff.
Yes, this is not. Yeah, they just they unfair. Just the small dog, got that one lucky strike in and it killed the big dog.
Yeah, and again, the tactical discrepancy, not only because of the Air Force, but because of the infantry as well. And I actually want to talk about the destruction of New Chimoyo, which happened in 1979. So this is kind of like, we were talking about it off air. This is kind of like the Death Star 2 situation. So Chimoyo was the town that was nearby to the guerrilla base camp that was destroyed in Operation Dingo. But in 1979, almost at the end of the war, while Rhodesia is teetering on the brink of a conventional war, as we talked about last episode, they really thought that they were going to be very soon faced with a full-blown conventional war. And so the book here actually gives us a pretty cool tactical rundown, and I want to talk about it and give viewers an idea, because this is kind of my bread and butter, about the nuts and bolts and the moving pieces of the destruction of New Chimoyo, which was very similar to what had happened at the first Chimoyo battle. So inside Mozambique, Zanla resolved to abandon dispersion tactics and to stand and resist further Rhodesian incursions. So the base camp areas at Chimoyo had been repeatedly attacked and overrun, like we just talked about, and a vast new base was built near the old devastated site, and it was called New Chimoyo, okay, Death Star 2. The camp was dominated by a high hill, and East German advisors were supervising the blasting of bunkers into the earth. So again, international war, right? This is still the Cold War. We've got East Germans, we've got Soviets, the whole 9 yards. But there were East Germans on site supervising the construction of bunkers here. The largest concentration of flak weapons ever assembled by Zanla, including 23 millimeter mountings, was deployed on the hill and in the trench complexes on the plain below the hill. So imagine a big hill, giant plain around it with trenches surrounding it. A system of concentric trenches, each with a flak site at its center, was spread throughout the 64 square kilometer encampment. So ginormous encampment, okay? Rhodesian ComOps headquarters, Combined Operations Headquarters, was determined to smash the complex at the time when international efforts to solve the Rhodesian conflict were reaching a climax, right? This is 1979, so we're approaching the end of the war. A massive military defeat for Zanla would weaken its leader's bargaining position at the Lancaster House Constitutional Conference. But the Rhodesian security forces were at that stage of the war fully stretched on internal and external operations. Only 200 men were available to assault the camp. The elite Selu Scout Support Company was allocated the assault, with the Rhodesian light infantry providing stop groups beyond the camp to hem in the guerrillas. So if you imagine this camp, they set up a support by fire at what was codenamed Madison Square. And let's see here. Does it stay here? Yeah, position of 25-pounder artillery battery giving supporting fire onto the guerrilla positions on the hill. And so the RLI stop group was, imagine, spread out over several kilometers. You have several platoons of Rhodesian light infantry set up in the bush on the far side of the objective. Okay, so you have the support by fire on one side, and then on the northern side, you have this large stop group. Okay. The Selu scouts are allocated for the actual trench assault. So again, talking about the disparity of the light infantry tactics, these guys know that in a close quarters battle, they are no match, right? The guerrillas are no match for the Selu scouts. And so more or less support by fire. We don't have any diagrams, so we don't need to dig into this too much. Try not to nerd out on it, but support by fire, artillery, machine guns, hammer these positions. Selu scouts, and this is a multi-day battle, but they cleared the trenches, and the many of the flak batteries, and then they stormed Monte Cassino on days 1 and 2. Monte Cassino was the code name for the very tippy top of the hill where the bunkers were located in several of the flak positions. And yeah, same thing. They just completely wiped them out. And yeah, they did have Canberra Air Force bomber support, but it's just, I mean, the guerrillas are not prepared to execute a conventional attack like that, despite the fact that they are massing forces for a potential conventional war if the Lancaster House peace talks fall out. I mean, when 200 men can wipe out a force of several thousand, because it says here they had 6,000 guerrillas with them when the Rhodesians opened their attack. I mean, it's not even fair. The Selu scouts were rehearsing mock attacks for weeks before the raid. The task force was mounted on the Unimog 2.5-ton vehicles. They were armed with machine guns, so similar to what we saw at Nine Zonia. The shock force of 100 men who formed like the immediate assault group that dismounted and assaulted the trenches had 10 of these trucks, one for each stick, which again, we talked about sticks earlier. They were kind of like a squad. And yeah, I mean, it's like this is textbook infantry assault. This is textbook combined arms assault, coming from the infantryman's perspective. And if this was, say, a Western army or a conventional army, or if this was Germany in, the Second World War and this was an American force attacking it, 200 men and going up against 6,000 would be laughably suicidal, right? But it wasn't for them. In 3 days, they managed to wipe out and capture this entire complex at the end of the war when they're running out of bullets and gas. So it is often said that the Rhodesian military was the best counterinsurgency force in the world. This is why. Okay, this is why they had good tactics. And we can talk about, if you'll permit me to ramble a little bit more, there's a good example in here of a fire force raid. So we talked about fire forces last time. But I want to kind of dig into this here because I get another play-by-play in this book, courtesy of Peter McLaughlin. This is in the Chiduku TTL, 150 kilometers east of Salisbury. There's a large mountain called Rambwe, which is named after a former tribal ruler, and the guerrillas were using it as a base. Because of its physical prominence, it was an ideal rendezvous point for groups infiltrating from Mozambique. The mountain lay 8 kilometers from the main Salisbury-Umtali road. From Wambwe, the guerrillas crossed the narrow strip of European farming land around the tiny hamlet of Inyazura to and from operations in the Mokoni TTL. By 1978, about 500 guerrillas fighting in the region were using it from time to time. In late December 1979, an African herder on a European farm bordering on the Chiduku TTL spotted a group of guerrillas moving across the farm and reported this to his employer. For the next 4 days, guerrilla tracks were found on the farm trailing west. There was obviously a large-scale movement of guerrillas from Mokoni TTL to Chiduku. The farmer and a handful of his African militiamen sprang an ambush on a guerrilla group filtering across the farm the night before the ceasefire was due to come into effect. The next morning, 2 Alouette 3 helicopters searched the Rambwe Mountain as it was suspected the guerrillas had hidden there. They reported nothing. The BSAP, the British South African Police, so that comes from the British South Africa Company. It's just old holdover name.
Yes.
Yeah. At Rusape, they deployed 2 sticks of their counterinsurgency forces, strike force, comprising 11 European regulars, reservists, and African auxiliary constables to search the kraals in the valley at the base of the mountain. The sticks were dropped to the north of the mountain by Alouette 3s at noon and began to sweep along its western face. So get that picture in your mind. All right. Towards the southwestern spur, they picked up the tracks of a large number of guerrillas leading up the steep mountainside. The guerrillas were, in fact, assembling their forces on Rambwe before moving on to St. Anne's Mission in the east, and then to a Commonwealth Monitoring Force assembly point for the ceasefire. Because again, this is happening in 1979, right? So ceasefire is coming up. The Rhodesians are still trying to establish a better bargaining position by destroying as many of the guerrillas as they can. Okay. The Rhodesians' initial estimate of the guerrilla strength on Rambwe was 200, but after the end of the war, guerrillas testified that their strength was more than 400 on that day. Yet they had skillfully hidden themselves from the prying eyes of the Alouettes, which overflew the rugged mountain. The guerrillas had gathered there over the preceding days, and their logistics squad had cached water and maize meal porridge among the rocky outcrops high above the surrounding plain. So, this is one of the things that the guerrillas do excel at, okay? In a man-to-man gunfight, not good. But, as was the case with the Taliban, with the VC, caching, hiding amongst civilians, but also using the natural terrain, right? They excel at this. And this is every guerrilla group that's ever been successful has excelled at this. Okay. The ceasefire was 10 hours away. And let's see here. I skipped a paragraph. The patrol wound up in a single file, Rhodesian patrol, okay? Among the thick vegetation, they came across clearings, fireplaces, and other signs of the guerrillas' presence. At 2 o'clock in the afternoon, the patrol stumbled on a group of guerrillas resting among trees near the crest. The ceasefire was still 10 hours away. Both sides opened fire simultaneously, and the mountaintop erupted in volleys of small arms fire. The guerrillas were spread in their sections in a long half-kilometer crescent on ground overlooking the Rhodesian patrol, and soon had it pinned down with small arms and mortar fire. With minutes, they had the range, and one Rhodesian policeman was wounded by a mortar burst. Every time one of the patrol moved, he attracted heavy, accurate fire. The guerrillas roared obscenities at the pinned patrol and dared them to call fire force. The patrol had already done so. The controller at Grand Reef Forward Airfield, the nearest fire force base, replied to the request that it would be available only after 2 or 3 hours. but in a move typical of the informal arrangements at JOCS. An Air Force Wing commander at Rusape JOC, who was listening in on the contact, intervened and scrambled the fire force immediately. Flight time from Grand Reef was 45 minutes. The fire force, comprising 2 Alouette 3K cars, one armed with a 20mm cannon, the other with a multiple Browning 303 mount, 2 Bell 205 troop-carrying helicopters, a ground strike Lynx, and a Trojan utility aircraft mounted with Skyshout loudspeakers, arrived at 2:45 p.m. The police patrol threw 2 white phosphorus grenades to mark its position. The Lynx made 2 strikes on the guerrilla positions with napalm. Great orange tongues of flame splashed across the mountain, but the napalm's effectiveness was lessened by the rocky, broken terrain. The K cars closely followed the Lynx strike and passed across the front of the widely spread guerrilla positions, pouring in fire. They were engaged by a 12mm Dishka anti-aircraft machine gun the guerrillas had on the mountain. While the duel between the Alouettes and the guerrillas raged, the Bells deployed 6 sticks, so 30 men of the RLI, at the extreme northern tip of the guerrilla positions. These troops began to sweep the flank of the guerrilla line. Okay, so what you're seeing here is that vertical envelopment we talked about last time. This is what made the RLI and the fire force such an effective tactic, because the guerrillas, not being mobile, really just being transported by their own 2 feet, right? The Lamborghinis. Okay, when a patrol, whether that was policemen or reservists or local militiamen, when they found a element and were either pinned down themselves, as in this case, or hopefully a tree suppressing fire and pin down the guerrillas, they call in the fire force to begin a vertical envelopment. And that's what you're starting to see here. So now they've got kind of an L shape set up on the guerrilla with Rhodesian police and militiamen on one side and the RLI on the other side, forming an L shape. Okay. So they're sweeping the flank of the guerrilla line. One of the guerrillas, nestled in a tree, pins down the RLI with his machine gun. A fierce firefight develops between the guerrillas and the outnumbered RLI squads. The police patrol was able to extricate itself and withdrew to the base of the mountain and the crawls, straggling along the shallow valley below it. Long before the engagement broke out, the inhabitants had smelt trouble and had fled with their cattle. The patrol burnt their huts in retaliation for their failure to inform the security forces of the guerrillas' presence on the mountain. The police patrol was then evacuated by a Bell, which had returned from Grand Reef FAF with ammunition for the 20mm cannon of one of the Alouettes. The ground support Lynx returned from Grand Reef towards sunset and once more seared the guerrilla positions with napalm. By this stage, the guerrillas were withdrawing southwards on the mountaintop and working their way up into the rocky outcrops on the crest. A guerrilla mortar squad tried to knock down one of the Alouettes with its 60mm mortar. 2 Hawker hunters orbited high overhead in the late afternoon sun, but were unable to make their attack runs because the RLI sweep groups were so close to the guerrillas. They made a dummy run, but they needed a 150-meter safety margin and called off the strike. At sunset, the RLI sticks were evacuated to Grand Reef, and an eerie quiet settled over the napalm-scorched mountaintop. At 2 o'clock the following morning, 2 hours after the ceasefire came into effect, a company of 8th Battalion Rhodesia Regiment deployed into the combat zone from Rusape to cordon off the guerrillas. Early next morning, the fire force dropped onto the mountain again and swept it. One wounded guerrilla who had been left behind put up resistance and was killed, but the rest of the force had escaped under the cover of darkness and fled towards St. Anne's Mission. Despite the intensity of the action, only 15 guerrillas had been killed. The rocky outcrops which dominated the crest had reduced the effectiveness of the napalm strikes and the fire from the helicopter gunships. The withdrawal of the fire force at dusk had enabled the guerrillas to retreat in good order and escape to the nearby ceasefire assembly point and the end of the war. So that's that whole chapter. Thank you for letting me ramble. My voice is shot.
You're good, and that's basically the last contact of the war.
Damn near.
It's pretty much, that's a pretty good example of the fire force, I would say.
Yeah, it's that vertical envelopment.
So, we're about, 17 out from being 2 hours on. You want to maybe end it here?
Let's talk about the very end of the war. That way, next time we can just talk about Rhodesia in the decades afterwards. There's not really a lot to say here unless you want to dig into politics, which I don't really want to. I'm more interested in the military stuff.
I wasn't really prepared much into the war notes for that.
I do have one.
You do have one. Well, we can say that. We can save it for next episode to end off the series.
Yeah. I just have a couple of numbers on the guerrilla forces, if you'll permit me.
Yes.
Because earlier we did talk a lot about how the guerrillas were operating in small numbers throughout the war and trying to give the impression well, not the impression, trying to tell the story of the Rhodesian Bush War, it's this constant groundswell of security problems, right? In the beginning of the war, the Rhodesian forces think, oh, well, this is really just a police matter. This is a minor security problem. It's not that bad. We're not in a full-blown war. Okay, and the guerrillas are caching. They're developing logistic networks, Mujiba networks of supporters. They're sending out their political cadres. They're generating support. Okay, so by the end of the war, this is 1979. Let's see, where's my number here? Where's my number? So the assembly points, right? At the end of the war, mediated by the British with the Lancaster House talks, the agreement when the ceasefire began was that all the guerrillas were supposed to report to assembly points, okay, APs. And this was how they would more or less deal with the aftermath of the war and not the surrender of the guerrilla forces, but demobilization, that's the word. Of the 22,000 guerrillas in APs, okay, let me say that again, 22,000 in APs, about 16,500 were Zanla and 5,500 were Zebra. So again, an interesting point. In the beginning of the war, as we talked about in earlier episodes, Zebra was kind of the main spearhead, but after Mozambique falls, Zanla is really the big shit kicker in this war. Okay, they're the big guerrilla army. Now there's conflicting information about, how many of these people are actually trained guerrillas, how many of them are just civilians, hangers on. There's some people that said that Zebra was, more effective militarily, despite the fact that they had a smaller force, and Zanla had a larger force, but they were less effective militarily. And that actually, a lot of that discrepancy in the kind of the shit talking between those two groups goes into the politics of Rhodesia after the war is over, and Zimbabwe, and we'll talk about the genocide that happens there later. But kind of setting the stage for that. 22,000, okay, armed guerrillas. Maybe plus or minus a couple thousand, but think about that. A country that in just 5, 6, 7 years ago, the government thought they had maybe 100 armed, trained, hardcore guerrillas that they had to wipe out. Okay, several years later, 22,000 of them are showing up at these camps, rifles in hand, ready to demobilize. So despite the fact that the Rhodesians had a ridiculous firepower disparity, despite the fact that they killed many times their number in guerrillas, it's just not enough, because that's how guerrilla wars work. And that's how guerrillas end up winning, is they attrit you and they make you quit. You run out of, and we also haven't talked a whole lot about we've talked about it tangentially, but the international community really abandoning Rhodesia. And there's a guy on Twitter, I think his name is Will Tanner, who actually does a lot of really good threads on this, and how the West turned their back on Rhodesia. And you guys can go check that out if you want to.
He's been posting a lot of late about that, and they did, and really the war is just sort of like this slow saga of everybody basically abandoning them to the point that they have nothing left.
Mm-hmm. And you'll hear Rhodesian vets say that. I've heard on podcasts that we ran out of fuel, we ran out of diesel, we ran out of bullets. You can't fight a war no matter how hard you try when that happens. And again, these guys were fighting up to the 11th hour. It's not like they gave up, but it just was an untenable situation. They didn't quit, but they were defeated, not necessarily, again, tactically or militarily, but strategically and politically. So.
Mm-hmm. Well, do you want to say that's a wrap for this episode?
I think that's a good place to end it, man.
All righty. Well, thank y'all for listening in. This has been, Otto Hawker.
You want to hit some plugs? Got any plugs?
Just, again, follow us, on our, Twitter, follow us on, Spotify, follow us on YouTube, like and subscribe, share, follow us on Substack. You can find me as Otto Hawker on Substack and Twitter. Just find the Robin Hood.
Yeah. You can find me on Twitter at Peter_C_Thistle. I don't really use Twitter a whole lot. I delete it off my phone and then I reinstall it like once a week and then I delete it again because it's toxic. If you want to get in contact with me, probably DM me on Substack, because I do use Substack pretty much daily. Join the Old Glory Club. Go follow the Old Glory Club. Find one of the local chapters near you. Join up.
Go find people that like bushstroke.
Yeah, go to White Boy Summer Apparel. I think they have WBS Apparel. I think they're selling Rhodesian bushstroke shorts now.
They are. But the only problem is that summer's basically over.
Yeah, it's coming to a close. Huh?
then you can look cool out dove hunting with them.
That is correct. That is correct.
Just, make sure to have the appropriate safari shoes to go with.
Of course. Of course.
Alrighty, well, I've been Otto Hawker.
All right, man. This has been Peter Thistle for the Bush War podcast. This was a good one.
So 3, thank you.
All right. Good night.
Good night.